Honorable Ministers Morneau, Duclos, Taylor, and Baines, thank you so much for joining me via webinar to hear this proposal. And you too, Justin. Please address any questions you might have via Twitter. Canada's social safety net is frayed to the breaking point. Our income security structures are crumbling. Canadian income inequality remains rampant, social crises like homelessness and food insecurity are rapidly growing, and good jobs are disappearing fast. We need to change our approach to income security in this country. Social assistance involves all levels of government. The federal government provides the universal childcare benefit, the Canada Pension Plan, old age security, employment insurance. Provincial governments provide disability support, healthcare, and both provincial and municipal governments play roles in housing supports. We could just make our social assistance programs more generous, broader, and more effective. We could make programs less mean-tested and more universal. Or we could simply guarantee a minimum level of income for anyone who falls below it. Funding is not only grossly inadequate to lift people out of poverty in Canada, but grotesquely mismanaged and poorly distributed. Our means-tested social assistance structures treat people like children and keep them entrenched in cycles of poverty where they are punished for their attempts to build a better life, like finding a job, and systematically smacked back down. Our current income security structures, policies, and programs provide too little financial support, leave tens of thousands to fall through the cracks, disincentivize people from improving their situations, reproduce inequalities across generations, and balance the heaviest burdens of our society on the backs of the most vulnerable. If you're on social assistance and you land a job, you can immediately lose everything and find yourself worse off dollar for dollar. If you decide to go back to school, you can lose everything. You can be punished for having too many people in the house, or a spouse, or not being able to fill out dozens of arcane forms every month.
Social assistance programs that have been designed actually not just to help people who are not working, but discourage people from working because they claw back dollar for dollar any assistance that people are getting when they go to work, create really perverse incentives around people engaging with the labor market at all.
This is the gradient of poverty and health. People in Canada who live in the poorest neighborhoods live about 13 to 17 years less than people in the richest neighborhoods, depending on what study you look at. And it's even greater when you factor in disability.
The gradient means we got to make common cause between people who are not poor and poor. If there's a 17-year gap in disability-free life expectancy, it means the average person has 8 fewer years of healthy life expectancy.
You might wonder, is money really life and death? There's so many other problems: racism, sexism, educational deficit. How could just giving people money really make such a difference?
In the real world, the social determinants of health pile on top of the same people and interact and intermingle with each other in really important ways, so that poverty leads to poor school readiness, leads to lower educational attainment, which limits people's job prospects, which are further narrowed by racism, which leads to stress and chronic illness, which makes it hard to keep a full-time job, which leads to more poverty.
Poverty isn't the inability to live large. It's not big houses, fast cars, and fancy clothes. Poverty is the inability to live a healthy life at all, or at least to have any decent shot at it. The opposite of poverty isn't wealth, it's justice. But poverty and inequality aren't just morally impermissible, deeply unjust, and contrary to everything we claim to stand for as Canadians. They're also extremely expensive. Our unnecessary spending on socioeconomic costs like healthcare and law enforcement are ineffective, counterproductive, and unnecessary. The avoidable annual costs of poverty have been calculated at up to $9.2 billion in British Columbia, up to $3.8 billion in Saskatchewan, and up to $13.1 billion in Ontario. That works out to about $1,000 per year per person for the Ontario study, $2,000 per year per person for the British Columbia study, and just under $4,000 per year per person for the Saskatchewan study. No national studies have been yet completed, but scaling up to the population of Canada, that gives us an average cost of poverty of more than $90 billion per year. That's a lot of wasted resources. So we urgently need to address the crises of poverty and inequality. And we know social assistance is ineffective, wasteful, and thoroughly problematic. But there is an alternative: a universal basic income. The concept is simple. If someone earns less money than a certain level that we decide no human should fall below, we make up for the difference so that they do. A guaranteed basic income keeps you at that level, even if you lose your job, or you get a job, or you get sick, or you go back to school. It removes the paternalism of social assistance and replaces it with stability, predictability, and real security. How did this is a closed webinar. Anyway,
It turns out actually when you support low-income people in getting up out of poverty, they will use that money as you would wish that they would. And there's no need to spend extra money on trying to police how they do it. It actually creates an incentive for people to work and is much less judgmental and invasive into people's life choices in terms of how they spend their money.
The ideology of a universal basic income guarantee depends entirely on its implementation. Neoliberal conservatives like Richard Nixon and Milton Friedman advocated for it. So did radical progressives like Carol Pateman and Eric Olin Wright. Centrist private business magnates like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Pierre Omidyar have advocated for it. The ideology comes into play in whether a basic income is sufficient to lift people out of poverty and thrive as equal citizens, or squash social assistance into a singular manageable allowance for base subsistence. And basic income is not just for the poor. With the rapidly changing nature of work in Canada toward greater precarity and less security, about half of Canadians are now living paycheck to paycheck. There's more uncertainty than ever. This is a solution for everyone. Otherwise,
what we'll see is greater inequality. We'll see a declining middle class, more and more people slipping into low-income categories and less capable of offering their children and their families the kinds of opportunities that we've taken for granted for a number of years.
Dr. Evelyn Forget has become almost synonymous with basic income in the Canadian context, from her research showing the social and health benefits of a pilot program that ran for about 5 years in Manitoba. A limited version has also been tried in Finland, which Forget spoke on just a few months ago.
Finland ran a 2-year basic income experiment. And one of the key findings was that people who received a basic income engaged in more pro-social behavior. That is, they had greater trust in one another. They were more likely to trust government, to trust the organizations and the institutions that existed in society. I think that allowing people to participate fully in society encourages them to become productive and helpful neighbors. I mean, I think we all want to be part of the same community that we live in.
The most striking fact from Forget's findings in the Canadian context?
We saw an 8.5% decrease in hospitalizations. Kids stayed in school longer. There were fewer visits, outpatient visits, particularly around issues relating to mental health in the healthcare system. People had children later, and they had fewer children. I mean, if we had discovered a drug that reduced hospitalizations by 8.5%, we would be putting it in the water, right?
What about laziness? Universal basic income test runs done in Canada in the 1970s showed that around 1% of the recipients stopped working, mostly to take care of their kids. On average, people reduced their working hours by less than 10%. The extra time was used to achieve goals like going back to school or looking for better jobs.
More recently, the Ontario government ran a pilot project in the cities of Hamilton, Thunder Bay, and Lindsay, where people had their income topped up to cutoffs at about $17,000 for a single person and $24,000 for a couple. Since social assistance programs were rolled into it, it wasn't enough to raise people out of the low income measure or low income cutoff levels, otherwise called LICO, but it was enough to lift people out of the market basket measure of poverty. It was cancelled this spring, however, 1 year early.
People signed up expecting it would last a full 3 years.
It wasn't long enough to open that door and be able to actually get halfway there. Like you're almost there and then it was taken away.
Aside from the stress and hardship of those who had the rug pulled out from under them by the pilot's early cancellation, there were severe methodological problems with the project that undermined its ability to provide us with the sort of useful data that could have informed whether or not to roll out a basic income policy nationwide. First off, it was too short. We don't know how factors like work disincentives could play out in the long term, a downside which already began to decrease during the last years of the Manitoba experiment in the 1970s. Secondly, the Ontario government wasn't able to access social assistance records because of privacy barriers, and it didn't even have access to the tax records until after participants were signed on and enrolled. The actual enrollment process was pretty slapdash too, by sending out letters to solicit participation. All of this amounted to an incredible self-selection bias, which even the best quality of data, which we absolutely did not get, would not have been able to use effectively. Despite its short run and problematic implementation, though, the Ontario Basic Income Pilot still demonstrated a lot of promise for this type of policy, and the human benefits we saw in the pilot's run have been pretty staggering. Folks struggling with homelessness got off the street. Folks suffering chronic income insecurity found a little stability and were able to take control of their lives for the first time in a long time. The cold got warm, the hungry got fed, and the test communities did get a lot healthier. It's a call to action for another try, a real try. I'm not an economist. For a policy this important, a program this complex, and a project this big, we should take advantage of every possible human resource. Dr. Forget is an obvious choice, as is the prolific author and co-founder of Basic Income Earth Network, Guy Standing. We'd want to bring in experts on poverty, inequality, and the monumentous impacts they have on health and well-being, like Michael Marmot, Danielle Martin, Richard Wilkinson, Joseph Stiglitz, and Armin Yalnizyan. Basic income experts who can take lead roles to navigate political obstacles would also be vital, like former Conservative Senator Hugh Segal and NDP leadership candidate Guy Caron. What I'm proposing is a sufficiently prepared, adequately sized, intelligently conducted pilot program to determine how cost-effective and beneficial a nationwide universal basic income would be to our society. This is exactly what many experts proposed in 2016 as advice for the Ontario pilot. We need a lot of really good data. I would tentatively suggest starting with about 250,000 people, geographically diversified, with each set of cities randomly assigned to be either the control group or the test group. It doesn't have to be these cities, but they should have similar population sizes, demographics, and other factors we can control for. We'd want to adjust the parameters like the amount of income support given to see the impacts of raising people above the market basket poverty line, above the low income line, and beyond. Similar or smaller tests could be run concurrently or subsequently to flesh out this information better. After the initial run, we could expand the trial to larger cities to see if the data trends scale up. If we decide to raise people up to the low income measure, we'd be looking at about $475 million for the first 3 years gross. Rolling in social assistance makes it about $250 million. Rollout is simple once we determine the participants, checks in the mail. If we can learn how to eradicate poverty for just $250 million, it'll be one of the greatest bargains humanity has ever struck, and one of the most important. Factoring in the cost of poverty that we're already paying, we may very well discover that the pilot project turns out to be cost neutral, that giving everyone enough money to live on actually costs us nothing at all, or gives us a return back. This has some mind-blowing implications for a national rollout.
Parliamentary budget officers said it would probably be, on a national basis, to eradicate poverty, about $43 billion a year on the national account. National account is in excess of $350 billion a year. So it's less than 10%.
But that's the gross cost. Once a basic income brings people up out of poverty, social assistance programs would no longer apply. We spend more than $23 billion annually now just on social assistance. 20 or so billion dollars. The Canada Child Benefit already costs us about that much. The Canada Pension Plan already costs us about that much. Tax expenditures for the rich, loopholes and deductions we don't need, cost us $120 billion every year.
So if we can afford $122 billion for income assistance for people like you and me, can we afford $23 billion to provide income assistance for lower income people?
And again, that's the cost before we see the return on investment from reducing or even eliminating poverty in Canada.
You're spending a whole lot of money treating the consequences of poverty. If we can take some of that money and allocate it to families up front so that they can live reasonable lives, I think you'd see the returns downstream.
In case you don't remember from earlier, that could very well be up to $90 billion a year. I was born into the care system, but I had the obscene luck to be adopted into a wonderfully supportive family and community that wrapped around me and lifted me up. In my life and work, I've met many others born into the care system who were not so lucky. Lives full of extraordinary hardship, of addictions, homelessness, incarceration, and worse. Folks who really never had a decent shot at a healthy life because of the circumstances they were born into. In what world is that okay? In what Canada should a child's chance at a life that is healthy and decent be up to a dice toss when it doesn't have to be? Not my Canada. Basic income isn't a long shot, it's our moonshot, and we should take it. As a transformational policy consultant, community developer, and knowledge translator, my role would be to coordinate between experts and politicians to facilitate policy development, evaluate and interpret the social and economic impacts of the policy, and make the data available and accessible to all Canadians. That means rolling in storytelling and other things like that. This project informs my future practice with a deeper, richer understanding of how income and income poverty determine every aspect of our social and economic lives, our physical and mental health, and our whole society. We can't be good social workers without a comprehensive understanding of this. At best, we can be agents of social control. Deepening and broadening my understanding of poverty, its impacts, its potential solutions, and how it all plays into a capitalist neoliberal system has better prepared me for future practice with vulnerable and marginalized clients. Thank you so much for listening.